and that relieved that we're at this point. And Margaret, is that showing? There we go. Got it. All right. And it is an honor to be with Margaret. It has been my great joy to have her enter the program in American Studies, the doctoral program, and now working on her master's and her finishing her studies there at UNC. And I'm just so proud of her. And we do share a very tiny little corner of the Jewish South in northeastern Arkansas. And our family was very, very close to the Weinberg family and to the Weinberg women especially. And I'm so proud of the great work that Margaret's doing. And Birmingham is just such an important community in the American South. And as y'all know, in its history and its meaning and what it means to all of us as American Southerners today, as we fight for justice in this country. And also it has a lot of meaning to me because of its role in kind of the local food movement. People like Frank Stitt and Pardis at Highland Grill and, the local food movement. One of the birthplaces, I think, in the American South is really in Birmingham, as it is here in Chapel Hill too. So I'm gonna just walk y'all through a little bit of some kind of background and story about my work, and then we'll stop and we'll talk and have a conversation. But what I kind of how I think about this is that my food language, I kind of speak a food language like y'all do, and mine is Southern and Jewish. And I learned to speak it in the Arkansas Delta where I grew up. My grandparents were Eastern European Jews who came to America in the early 1900s. They settled in vastly different Jewish worlds. My mother's family in Connecticut, my father's in northeastern Arkansas. And in the early 1920s, my grandparents, Jimmy Cohen, who was a civil engineer, and his young bride, my grandmother Luba, they left their Russian immigrant families and also the vibrant Jewish worlds of New York to come to the rich agricultural lands of Mississippi County in northeastern Arkansas. That's where Margaret's family is from, in Osceola, and it's like 20 minutes away from where I grew up in Blytheville, and where that little red arrow is pointing to, right there along the Mississippi River, which just makes it a very dynamic world to be a part of that Mississippi River history and the strong immigration history that's tied to immigrant Americans that came and settled in that region. So in Mississippi County, up there in that northeast corner of Arkansas, my family became really enmeshed in the region's critical worlds of flood control, because you just saw that Mississippi River right there. So flood control and construction. So they were involved in building hundreds of miles of drainage canals and bridges and highways. So an important Jewish artifact in my family, besides like Shabbat candlesticks, is this drag line that says S.J. Cohen on it, located in Blytheville, Arkansas. That means a lot to me. So I want to take you for just a few minutes to the Southern and the Jewish food landscapes of my childhood. And I bet they're pretty similar to some folks that are with us tonight. For me, my Jewish food worlds were at home and at this synagogue. And this is Temple Israel, where I grew up, going to Temple in Blytheville. And I look through here and I know the Weinberg women are in that picture. And then my Southern food worlds were everything else, outside of the home and outside of the synagogue. So I'll show you, here are those Southern worlds. It's pretty black and white kind of division. All my friends were largely not Jewish. I had a tiny little handful of Jewish friends that went to Sunday school and we knew at synagogue, but they didn't even live in Blytheville. They traveled to synagogue. So I would visit with my Catholic and Protestant friends, and there I discovered all these foods that seemed exotic to me, because my New England born mother, Hattie Cohen, never prepared, kind of classic biscuits, or we didn't have, we didn't have a kosher home, but of course there wasn't really pork in it, no pork chops, no barbecue ribs. You would go out for that, which I'll show you. My dad's secretary, not Jewish, lived across the street from us, and she was an excellent cook. And I remember, speaking of artifacts, she had this mysterious can, that she kept on the top of the oven, on the stove. And I was like, what is that? And y'all know what that is. You put, bacon grease, and from the grease from you making your pork chops, and you use that to cook with and to flavor vegetables. Another real icon in where I grew up was the famous Dixie Pig restaurant, a really politically incorrect name for a restaurant, but they still keep it, right? There you could order a chopped barbecue plate, a pig salad for ladies, which is like a 2 pounds of pork, barbecued, pork, chopped pork on some iceberg lettuce. You could get a pig sandwich with cheese and slaw. And I think that might be one of the most non-kosher things in the whole world, maybe. And then I married my husband, Bill Ferris, and I was who's not Jewish, and but he's from Vicksburg, Mississippi, and his mother, who is a native of Vicksburg, Mississippi, further down the river from where I grew up, further expanded kind of my culinary knowledge of the American South, with lots of foods that were more connected to the worlds of Creole and New Orleans cuisine, because she was deeply connected to those worlds. All right, so back to my Arkansas worlds. Childhood, supper before Friday night, religious services at Temple Israel. We're our little synagogue where we went, our little synagogue in Blyville. My mother would make Shabbat roasted honey chicken and a sweet noodle kugel. We had that, a couple of times a month, probably. She was always rushing to get to Temple because she was like, a small group of Jewish women in charge of everything, and welcomed in the young rabbinic student, who came down from Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati to be our rabbi a couple of times a month. And if the young student rabbi wasn't there, then our parents conducted services for us. And on very special Friday nights, we ate fried chicken that was prepared by Richie Lee King, who was an African-American housekeeper who I adored, who worked for my family throughout our childhood. And there are long, deep, and incredible histories about the intersection between African-American women, Southern Jewish women, and the knowledge and the kind of contested spaces they share in the American South. So after Shabbat services, our parents would gather in this kind of family recreation room, and somebody would bring, sweets like a marble cake, and they drink lots of coffee before they got back in their cars and drove the half an hour, 45 minutes to Southeast Missouri, back to Osceola, these little towns in the Boot Hill of Missouri and nearby. So when my Arkansas grandmother, Luba, passed away, I inherited her rolling pin. And besides that drag line, and then some of the photography that you're seeing that I inherited from my grandmother, from that she must have taken or bought from her early days in Arkansas. She was a young woman, as I said, who came down from New York City. But I have this rolling pin, and I used to think she brought it from Russia with her, but I think she probably brought it on the Lower East Side somewhere. But it's a great and important artifact to me. And I also received her recipe box. And in that, and I know we were going to talk a little bit about important artifacts to us. That was a really important one for me to get my hands on. And it was right when I was beginning my graduate work. And I opened up that box and I was like, wow, there is a network of Southern Jewish women and non-Jewish women in the Northeast Arkansas that my mother, and then the family members from my mother's, the women in my mother's family in New England, and they're all kind of listed right there. I can see their names like in front of me right now. There's the card for the Brer Rabbit molasses sugar cookies, which are the ones that y'all had. And my grandma Luba would make those. She'd make them really tiny, but that's a really important branded, Southern branded, kind of racially branded product, Brer Rabbit molasses. And, so baked into these recipes literally is like this kind of deep, powerful history of our region, of Judaism, of Jewish identity and history in our region. So you can see all those collected recipes there. And it really, in that box, I kind of saw that culinary journey that my grandmother made from Eastern Europe to New York to Arkansas. And it shaped my identity. It obviously shaped hers. So long story short, but in the 1990s, I'd gone away from Arkansas to go to school, to college and university. And then eventually I came back to work for the Institute of Southern Jewish Life in Jackson, Mississippi. And that is now located and just opened in New Orleans. And y'all may have heard of that. I'll show you a slide about it. But one of the first projects we did was I worked with Bill Aaron, who's a terrific photographer, and we did a photo documentary oral history project where we were driving all over the South. We came to Alabama as well, and we hung an exhibit in Old Town, Alabama, and just it was an amazing experience. There's just a little bit to show you, one slide just to show you about the new museum in New Orleans. I haven't been there yet. It just opened, but I love the little bagel there that they have in their collection, which is from the Crew de Jew, Mardi Gras crew, Jewish Mardi Gras crew. It's their item they throw out to the crowd, their bagel throw for Mardi Gras parade. So we road tripped across the region. It was a trip. The photographer I was working with, Bill Aaron, was vegetarian, also kept kosher. So eating was a challenge as we drove around the region. He was always asking me if there was pork in whatever restaurant we were at, like a classic meat and three diner, or even a country club with Jewish folks. And I'd be like, yeah, there's probably is in everything. But food stories wove in and out of our travels. And I heard a lot of voices of African-American women, women of color, who've largely we've been silenced in Southern Jewish history. And Jewish Southerners told us who they were through the foods they ate and what they didn't eat, as well as where they ate. So, from the early South to the present, each generation of Southern Jews have balanced their religious and their regional identities as they've thought about the plates in front of them. And y'all probably know a lot of this history, but in the colonial and in the antebellum South, Jews interacted with enslaved African Americans and Native Americans and Caribbean islanders and newly arrived European immigrants. And during the 19th century South, Jews adapted their culinary traditions within these predominantly white Christian worlds. They adopted the region's contested traditions of race and class and gender. And I have a colleague named Anton Heike. He's a historian. He describes that Southern Jews had a very ambivalent status, which I'm sure you can understand, and considered themselves really as kind of integrated outsiders. So as Southern Jewish identity evolved, Jewish women were really the keeper of family food ways and food cultures, and they determined kind of the culinary grammar of Southern Jewish cuisine. And I'm gonna wrap up here, but I just wanted to show you kind of two women from the past. That was Miriam Gratz Moses Cohen. She was the niece of the very important Jewish educator Rebecca Gratz from Philadelphia. And this woman was married to Solomon Cohen of Georgetown, South Carolina. She kept a journal that I was introduced to that's in the collection of the Wilson Library of the Southern Historical Collection at the University of North Carolina. And this was, again, one of those kind of like that recipe box. When I opened up this journal, I was like, wow, this is it. But this is a woman speaking to me even further back than my own grandmother, of course. This Miriam Gratz Moses Cohen kept this diary from 1828, wrote recipes in it, and it was filled with both very Southern, like recipes for pound cake and spoonbread. And then here we are for kugel, right? Gookogle, Pesach sponge cake, Haroset, Passover soup dumplings. And that was very powerful to me. Here's another family, the Minus family, Lavinia Minus of Savannah. She advised her family to keep the Sabbath holy, to follow the laws of kashrut. She wrote her husband Abram when he was away on business and traveling on Shabbos, "I do not think that you will regret ever having kept the Sabbath holy, Abram dear, although it's not more than a right-minded man should do." So she was kind of in charge of the religiosity of her family. One of her sons wrote her and said, was at college in Kentucky, and said, "Send me a care package for Passover. I know you're going to send me matzah. Put some of your pickles in the care package." And I'm just gonna kind of wrap up from there. And I just think that this is a long and interesting and evolving history. Southern Jews have eaten and shaped their religious and cultural and economic lives through mobility, adaptation, pragmatism. They've passed their recipes and memories and practices from one generation to the next. And I'm going to stop right there. There's many, many issues that kind of that impact our story, but I want folks to talk and get to be involved. So Margaret.
Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation and for walking us through. We would love to take this time, and this is great too, because we are a number of people that can all be seen on one Zoom screen.
Okay, good.
So much easier. So would love to welcome anybody's questions. Does anyone have one to start with? Otherwise, I will throw one out, but would love to welcome a question if anyone has one to start. Yeah, Barbara.
I'd like to know if you have found a Jewish food from the South, which has specifically been changed because of the Black cook influence. Can you give us an example of that, or several?
Yeah. Oh, there are so many. I think that's the most significant factor that I noticed in all the work I did and in all the families I spoke to. And it could be the way you prepared matzoh ball soup. From the simplest, the most kind of subtle. If an African American woman decided she, would just had a basic kind of way of preparing a chicken, even though, there was the woman that she worked with certainly, it required or demanded a specific way of doing it. You could still see their imprint of their intellectual contribution and agency in shaping recipes. It could be matzoh ball soup. It could be brisket, where we start to see that kind of, oh, that intersection between Southern brisket and barbecue traditions and African-American barbecue knowledge as pit masters in the region, impacting how Southern Jews prepared brisket. So many other things. Yeah, just almost everything.
I will say I love that example because my favorite Southern Jewish recipe from my grandmother's cookbook is a barbecue brisket that we always have on Passover.
Yeah. I think about, like, there was a recipe that I had in Matzoh Ball Gumbo for like a dirty, like, what a dirty rice is, like, white rice casserole that you might put sausage or bell pepper and green pepper and onion in it. And instead of a dirty rice, they made like a dirty kind of matzah casserole. And I'm sure that was an African-American cook having an influence there.
Marcie, I wonder if you could speak to, because I think this is relevant to Barbara's question, which is such an interesting one. And I think, Barbara, that question applies so well to sort of broader Southern foodways also. Marcie, could you talk a little bit about how your work on Southern Jewish foodways has influenced your sort of broader work in looking at the larger landscape of Southern foods and maybe vice versa?
Yeah, sure. I was very interested in, when I was doing my doctoral work, one of my advisors, doctoral advisors, is a folklorist named John Vlatch. And in my folklore classes, I had taken folklore classes before as an undergrad, and I thought a lot about, well, what's my folklore? What's my folk experience? And I knew that it was being a Jewish Southerner, that there was deep ritual and tradition and history. And because our numbers were smaller, there were certain ways that the people in my congregation and what I learned about in the region, and I know it's the same in Alabama, there were certain ways that people survived and cared for one another and protected one another. And I knew that foodways, how people cooked, integrated themselves into the larger American South, protected themselves and created boundaries as a Jewish community in a racially fraught region. That food would tell us a lot about those experiences. And that was my lens. I just knew I saw a difference in how we ate growing up in the Southern community I grew up in, and I was really interested. There was very little to read about it. And there was so much to read about the American Jewish experience and even American Jewish domestic worlds and foodways in the Northeast, in urban American Jewish life, but very little in the American South. Eli Evans' work, The Provincials, was an important book to me. He grew up in Durham. His father was a mayor of Durham. He went to UNC. A lot of his family went to Duke. There was a lot of food stories in his memoir, and that was deeply important to me. And and also a wonderful, like Margaret is doing in her work, I found a dissertation by a great scholar, American Jewish scholar named Carolyn Lipson Walker, who I think is recently retired from running the Jewish Studies program at Indiana University. And it was a folklore study of Southern Jewish life. So that was the first thing I found. So Margaret, you asked, how did that kind of expand? I knew that kind of led me into the rabbit hole of food studies. And I wanted to understand more about why Southern foodways are the way they are, or what it tells us about our region. And again, I was looking for kind of foundational sources that I could use in the classroom. And that led me to work on a volume that I thought would be helpful in the classroom. And that's this book called Edible South, which looks at lots of different voices and lots of different moments in the American South, and to see what food tells us about these times.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. Well, I don't want to hog the question floor. I think Glynis has a question.
I do. And so I guess my question is Southern food, Jewish Southern food, does it really speak differently in the South than it does in other parts of the country? I did not grow up Jewishly. My mother is, I grew up in Mississippi. I still have her iron skillet. I still have, these tools. And you mentioned food and the way that it shows care for people. And when the hurricane came through and just wiped out the Mississippi Gulf Coast, we couldn't find my mother. We sent the police to find her. She was in the backyard cooking on the grill all of the things that were thawing out in her deep freeze so that she could take them down to the Veterans of Foreign Wars post and feed people. And so the concept of food and caring is, for me, very Southern. And when I became a Jew by choice, I found that same culture. But it makes me wonder, is it the same across the country, or is it really a Southern Jewish thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a really important question. And first of all, where are you from? Biloxi or Gulfport or?
Gulfport.
Gulfport.
Yeah,
So
I grew up in Gulfport.
Yeah,
Right. And the last hurricane that was really severe down there, it was traumatic.
Oh, it was devastating. We knew a lot of since my husband's family is from Mississippi, we knew many people that just had those concrete steps left, of the foundations of their home. And so many people cooking, just like you said, it was the most powerful thing. So I think our history in the region, our specific history of Southern Jews, does make our particular food experience unique in the American Jewish experience. It's not like there are specific dishes that stand out more so than really any other region. But I think because of the history of enslaved African Americans in this region, of the indigenous people in our region, of the European immigrants that Jewish people were a part of, that intersection, that history in the American South, if you start, from the Outer Banks of North Carolina to Jewish, where there were the very first kind of Jewish,
Just raise your hand and.
Jewish person that was on one of those early, exploratory ships to Charleston or Savannah. There's just a really complex history of those peoples coming together. And so I see a very powerful and complex story in which food helps us to understand that story. So it's just for me, food is a way of understanding Southern Jewish experience of race, of place, of gender, of negotiating all those factors in a place. And so because we live in a particularly complex region probably one of the most complex regions of the country, and one of the earliest regions of the country, there's a big story to tell. And food also takes me to Southern Jewish women and to voices that have been largely silenced in Southern Jewish history. We know a lot usually about like founding men in congregations, across the Jewish South, or the first rabbi in, in Charleston, or the first male congregants. But when I would go to archives and start to look for where did food take me, it took me to women. And it took me to women of color, and it took me to Southern Jewish women who had boarding houses and took over their husbands' businesses when a husband died. And, you just saw them as in places of labor as well.
What I love about what you just said, Marcie, and to get sort of related to Glynis's point too, is that I think that last part in particular about sort of finding women and history through food, that's so applicable beyond the Jewish community also, even in the stories that you all are exchanging, when you look at food stories, does become a way to find women in all different types of populations who may not be in the archive otherwise.
Yeah.
Which I think is amazing. Victoria, I see your hand going up. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, so I saw in one of your pictures a family grocery store, and and hearing you talk about what is my folklore, I was thinking about how part of my family's folklore is that my grandparents had a deli. They had a kosher deli.
Yeah.
And one of the stories that got passed down is how when like Black jazz musicians, like all of the greats would tour, there were limited options for where they could get food. And so the deli would prepare sandwiches and like have them taken to the airport so that the performers could eat them on the plane as they were flying to their next city and stuff. But I was wondering, because I feel like a lot of immigrant families' stories also center around the stores, the delis, the grocery stores. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role that Jewish delis and grocery stores in the South played.
Yeah, and where's your family from?
From Birmingham. I mean, Johns, Alabama, and then Birmingham.
Wow. and
for that, Eastern Europe, yeah.
Wow. And so can you tell us just a little bit about their own deli history? What's the name of it? And
yeah, it was Felix's Delicatessen, and they lived over in Fountain Heights, which is part of Birmingham that's under an interstate now. And they, I mean, I remember stories about like the customers would come in and there'd be a guy who'd always ask my dad for the pickled herring that was at the very bottom of the barrel to make my dad stick his arm all the way in. And I also remember there was a Black man who worked in the store with them who drove the delivery truck and taught my dad how to drive over Morningside Drive when my dad was 10 years old. So all kinds of stories about that type of intersectionality, but all from like a male perspective.
yeah.
And then my grandmother, though, my grandfather passed away and my grandmother went on to be a really independent woman who baked and was a caterer. And so, yeah, everybody knows Tessie's mandel bread and Tessie's, I don't know what else everybody remembers of hers, but mostly it seemed like it was the mandel bread.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And I'm sure most people are really familiar with the history of your family's business. I that's what I saw were that delis and small grocery stores, but the delicatessens that develop specifically Jewish bakeries, Jewish butchers, and delicatessens, which there were some that were 19th century, late 19th century, but there were a lot more that developed kind of at the turn of the 20th century. And as they were able to kind of settle in and create more like specialty food stores, because I think the first Jewish merchants early on in the Jewish South in the 18th century, the early 19th century, you see them more as general dry goods store merchants, right? And so there's not enough Jewish people to have a delicatessen, or there's not enough of a cosmopolitan kind of consumer who doesn't have to be Jewish, but would still want to buy from a delicatessen. But that arrival of German Jewish, Eastern European Jewish, Central European Jewish that come from a delicatessen tradition, that's amazing. Of course, it's really where we look at it is in the Northeast, but they came south as well. And so that's a very little told story. There's some wonderful new books out, as I'm sure you're aware, on the history of delicatessens in America, but often the South is left out of that. So that was when I was doing my work on Matzoh Ball Gumbo, I didn't get to come to Birmingham to do research specifically, but when I'd go to, like, say, Charleston or Savannah or to Atlanta, I always talk to people about the stores and about delicatessen. And they were very important businesses, thrived, did well. And as you know, the demise is more commercial grocery stores in bigger cities like Atlanta that start to carry commercial Jewish standard products, right? They're available, streets and Menashevitz and, or you might even have a tiny little kosher section. But it was never like the care and the quality of what a family-owned business meant. But it was very difficult to keep those businesses open as our urban centers changed in the American South. Today, you may be seeing, I don't know what's happening in Birmingham, but like there's a new delicatessen pop-up and about to be a brick and mortar opening in Charlotte, North Carolina, called Meshuggah. And I saw non-Jewish friends going like, what does that mean? I'm like, what do you mean? What does Meshuggah mean? But we're back in that era where specialty food businesses, especially I think like after COVID, there's such an interest in brick and mortar and getting back and also interest in supporting the local food economy, that I think there's going to be a revival in delicatessen. And we're seeing quite a bit, which means like maybe 3 or 4 across the state in North Carolina. That's significant to me. But those people, those Jewish business owners were like as critical as a rabbi, right? Because you provided kosher meat, you provided challah, you provided the Jewish baked goods for holidays, you catered, everybody knew who to go to for weddings, bar mitzvahs, for holiday meal prep, all of that, right? So it was incredibly important, I think, in a certain size city like Birmingham, really it could thrive.
That is such a fascinating, Victoria. I had no idea that you had that historical connection. It's a really interesting story. And I think maybe Bernard had a comment or something to throw in on that.
And the sandwiches going to the jazz musicians is fantastic.
I was going to tell Victoria that I remember going with my mother and my sister when we go downtown shopping, and Felix and Tessie. And I remember Felix in the back of the building. They were plucking chickens and cleaning the chickens and killing the chickens. And Mama would get the chickens and we go home. And when she would start preparing, we always were so excited when we saw the eggs inside the chicken. It was just something else. And I remember Tessie used to get so upset when she had to get a schmaltz herring out of the barrel. Like you said, they had put on these long black rubber gloves up to elbow length. And she didn't like to do it at all. She would always call Felix to do it. But when Felix wasn't able to do it, you could see the expression on her face was something to behold. And she was a phenomenal baker. A phenomenal caterer. Just truly, truly memories of the childhood that I will never forget. And there'll never be delicatessens like that, because they didn't have any of the glitz or the glamour that contemporary delicatessens have now. It was just down to earth, and it's just, It was really, and people come in there and they just talk loud and you hear stories. It was a meeting place. It was more than just there to go to eat. You heard all the gossip, you heard all the news, and you had a great time. So thank you very much, Victoria, for your grandparents.
Oh,
And thank you, Bernard, for sharing that special memory. That is just amazing to hear you recount that.
but it's such a good point too about that it'll never like a business started by young Jewish Southerners today even, it'll never match up because that was a specific moment in time. It was like a portal that connected two worlds, right? Very much the old world of kind of tying a country of origin of European Jewish experiences, or they were just closer to that experience, even if they were born in the United States. They were much closer to those European Jewish experiences and memories, and you could feel that. You could feel that in the space. You could smell it, you could feel it. You felt that history. You felt even the history of, you know, of people that had experienced the trauma of World War II, of Jews who'd experienced the trauma of getting through World War II.
Yeah, and I think it's such an interesting point, and I'm glad that we've also gotten to some sharing of your own stories. I want to call on Naomi next, and then Arlene, because Naomi, I think I missed your hand a minute ago.
Well, it's actually Ed who has the question, so I'll let him
Okay.
talk.
You know, my family was all in, we're all in New England. But my grandmother came from the Ukraine and my grandfather came from Lithuania. And I'm wondering if my grandmother and grandfather were transferred to Little Rock or someplace in the Deep South, how would they have adapted to the different food sources that are available in the South that were not available in the Ukraine or Lithuania?
Yeah. That's a great question. It's a great question. And where did they end up in New England?
Eventually, Portland, Maine, and then Boston, and then Hartford, Connecticut.
And did they largely remain within a Jewish community? Was that their community?
I think they always had such attachments, and we still have a lot of relatives in Portland, and we still have a lot of relatives on the East Coast.
Yeah, yeah. That's powerful. I think if for some reason they'd gotten on a different ship and ended up with family members or some business connection that had brought them to Little Rock, they would have joined a synagogue right away, depending on when they arrived, but they probably would have joined a synagogue, and they would have been customers of all the Jewish food businesses that they could support in a city like the size of Little Rock. But they would have gone to regular grocery stores and complained a lot. You know, they'd be like, I can't believe there's nothing here for Passover. You know, there's like 3 boxes of matzah and it's not even kosher for this year.
Yeah, and you can't
or everybody would order, as like the Weinberg family did in Osceola. Everybody would order in bulk or go to Memphis to a delicatessen. Everybody drove all over the place.
Yeah.
So if you were lucky enough to end up in Little Rock, you probably because there was a pretty significant sized Jewish community there. But like in the Northeast Arkansas, you had to drive to Memphis. So you drove to Memphis and women shared that duty too. And you went to Halpern's and to the other wonderful delicatessen, couple of them, and brought it home. And then when you went back to New England, you schlepped everything back with you. You smelled like a big bag of bagels on the plane.
Well,
Right.
I don't know. What
just-
we're doing now in Birmingham is not so much driving, but for Passover, I ordered on the internet the stuff that I couldn't get here. It's still not perfect here.
yeah, but it has changed everything in a lot of ways. Yeah. But, you
Internet
know,
helped.
buying, yeah, absolutely. I
Yeah,
know.
that's such an interesting point that, you know, the internet, Amazon has changed so many things. I mean, I have ordered schmaltz by the jar off Amazon. So, I mean, you really can get anything you need.
I have those huge Hebrew national salamis in my freezer that I have to cut up into chunks and dole out to my 95-year-old mom. It's kept her going through COVID. Hebrew national salami.
That's awesome.
And I ordered it, and I'm embarrassed to say I ordered it through Amazon.
Arlene, I see your hand up also. Did you have a question? And then we only have a few minutes left. So after Arlene, I know we sent you all a prompt. If anyone has a story that they've not gotten to share, we probably have time for about one more comment after
All right,
Arlene's
that
question.
mine is more of a story. I could have
Great.
repeated word for word exactly what Bernard said about going there every Sunday. My father wanted the salami and the corned beef, and there were I was one of 3 girls, and we never were so good and quiet as sitting in the car, because otherwise our dad wouldn't take us. You know, if you were rowdy, you couldn't go the next time. So we sat there so quietly, because when we got there, Tessie comes from behind the counter and gives us a special treat, some type of candy, a little piece of halava, or just something really, really special. And it was one of the very first places, it's like it happened yesterday, that I was allowed to drive myself, was to Tessie's to pick up mandel bread and strudel. And my memory of the strudel, and maybe the mandel bread too, but I just vividly remember the strudel being in boxes where stockings from Raymond's came from. With wax paper. It was just like nothing else growing up here in Birmingham. And when I tell people all that stuff like that, it's just like, you know, just the ones that did grow up here have just such a fine memory of being Jewish growing up in Birmingham. It was amazing. And I left for almost 40 years and have recently come back, and it feels almost better than before, because now I'm a grown up and I'm the older generation. I can tell all these stories like other people could back in the day. So that's what I had to say. And I'm so glad you introduced yourself and told us who you are. I never would have pictured that. So thank you.
That's so beautiful. And I do see in the chats, I remember learning when I was doing my work on Matzoh Ball Gumbo about, is it Brody's?
Yeah, Brody's too.
Yeah. And because I think I was in touch with that family.
It was much later with Brody's, as I remember, you know, but, and Tessie continued doing it out of her home long after they closed the delicatessen. So,
well, are there any recipes that anybody has passed down within the community of like that strudel or that mandel bread from families?
Everything was just a little bit of this, some of that, a pinch of that. And my cousin Barry videotaped her once and tried to take notes on stuff. So there's somebody in the community there who pinged me on Facebook and said, if you ever need your grandmother's mandel bread recipe, I think I have it. I don't know who that was, but I also don't know if I trust that they actually have her recipe.
It just never tasted the same though. She used to cook them in ice cube trays. I mean, it was, you know, just whatever. I'm sorry. I'll stop. Let everybody else have a turn.
Thank you for sharing that memory. That's fascinating. And Marcie, do we have time for one more if anyone has one?
Yeah, of course.
I have a comment about Tessie's shnecken, which were a favorite in my family. I tried to beg that recipe from Victoria's father, and he said, just as Victoria had, that it's, you know, all in her head. You couldn't have gotten it. but I begged. It just didn't work.
Oh, Marcie, I want to let you have the last word, but I will say that this has been so wonderful hearing people's memories. And I think, one thing that's apparent just in this conversation to me is, even as we're talking, some of the things that Marcie was sort of telling us about in her presentation about the ways in which looking at these recipes and these foods reveal these connections, these networks, relationships, memories is really special and fun to see play out here. So I'm going to put a link to Matzoh Ball Gumbo in the chat, a link where you can purchase it through our local bookstore, Thank You Books, if you don't already have a copy. And we do have a copy at the shul also. So if anyone wants to check it out or get the molasses cookie recipe, let me know next time you're there and I'll help you find it. But I'll do that. And Marcie, I'll let you give us some final words before we close out for the evening.
Well, thank y'all for spending, maybe a little pre-Shabbat time with me. And it's really powerful to meet all of y'all and to hear your stories. Birmingham Jewish community, it's just got an incredible history. Alabama Jewish history is very powerful. And I think what I hope you'll do, my God, Victoria, your family has an incredible history. So you got to work with Margaret to make sure you document that history as much as you can. And Margaret will write an article on it, but that's a fantastic history that's got to be documented. So y'all go back and find a recipe that has Jewish meaning in your family and figure out how to make it. If you don't have it, like the mandelbread or the shnecken or the strudel, just get Ina Garten's and play around with it until it feels like your own, or you can modify it to get it to taste, because you'll know when it's like, that's it. That's as close as we've gotten. Or get a bunch of other women to try it and they'll be like, no, it's because you're missing lemon. You need a little nutmeg, or use butter instead of shortening, or, Crisco or whatever it is. But Margaret and I've done another program together where we baked jam cakes, which were an important holiday, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur time cake that my mom made with like blackberry jam and would serve right around high holiday time. And it means everything to me to make it. Like, that's my shnecken kind of thing. So find something, and it brings you a lot. It's, especially in this past year, gave me a lot of comfort to make those, hold on to those foods. And I bet, are there a lot of old synagogue cookbooks hanging around Birmingham too from the past?
Mm-hmm.
And I will say, Karen, who is on this call, actually put together a collection of recipes for Passover this year from members of our community.
That's many. I think ours wasn't it Cook and Tell? Isn't that the famous Bethel cookbook that we have?
Yeah.
Isn't that the one? Sue, you're on mute.
Oh, I think Sue, were you responding to that? You're muted.
I've got some back to when the older women were in the kitchen cooking for Shabbos lunches, and it's I look at them, and a lot of them are in their own handwriting. They wrote the recipes out and put it in the cookbook, and it's really special. Yeah, it brings back memories.
Yeah.
And from my generation, we have the cookbook that Roz has done, that Roz put out. She was the bar bat mitzvah queen, and all the events were catered by Roz.
Yeah. That's a really good point, Glennis. There were so many beloved women caterers that, like, one in many, in an urban setting, who did everything.
Y'all, this is from 1949, Temple Bethel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've got one thing that I'll add that came in late out because my wife sent me to the grocery. Oh, kind of appropriate. I've got my grandmother's recipes that are in index cards, take up huge amount of space, and her cookbooks from 100 years ago that we look at every once in a while, but it's really pretty amazing. I'm, hearing the conversation. When I think back on and look through those recipes and think back about the times I visited them, one was in Dallas and one was in Cheyenne, Wyoming. I still make the kugel that my grandmother from Wyoming used to make.
Oh, wow.
So I've got all that. So it really is interesting how those kind of connections, I mean, I hadn't heard y'all's conversation, but how those kind of connections bring back memories. They're roaring back just thinking about it today.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so powerful. Yeah. Save all those materials. And a lot of people think, oh, my kids won't be interested, but archives are like at the College of Charleston, the Jewish Heritage Collection, which is overseen by archivist Dale Rosengarten. I've given a lot of the cookbooks that I collected during my research to their collection. So there are libraries that definitely want your Southern Jewish materials, but also hang on to them for your own families. Digitize them.
I love that we're ending with a little homework and a call to action to remember and save these things and do some cooking. So thank you so much, Marcie, for such a wonderful program. And thank you all for those of you who are hanging on to the end of Zoom programming and joined us this evening.
Yeah. Everybody stay healthy and have a good Shabbat too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much.
Great to see you, Bernard.
Right outside the kitchen, the dairy kitchen, there is a bookshelf of old cookbooks.
Yes, I've seen it.
You might want to start researching some of those.
I know. I'm feeling like I got a little project, another project. Maybe you and I can work on that together, Bernard.
Whenever you want to.
Sounds good. Okay, y'all have a good evening.
Okay,
Bye,
good
Marcie.
Good night.
Thank you, Marcie.
Thank y'all.